Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first Meet the Experts episode of a new series from the Fractional XO. We have the privilege of knowing many, many smart people in the work that we do. And our model at fXO is to be able to bring fit for purpose experts into organizations. So, in addition to having us place an XO or a second in command in your organization, that XO has access to a vast array of curated, thoughtful experts. And we decided to start a series showcasing some of those experts. I'm joined today by our co-founder, also Ron Martin. Good morning, Ron.
Good morning.
And so let's go ahead and get right into it. So our guest today, and it's really a pleasure to have this guest expert be our first one because he has been a big influence of my life for the last probably 15 years. So we're joined today by Alan Prushan, who lives in the Philadelphia area, and Alan is a executive coach and consultant who believes that authority is intended to be given away. So he has this model called reciprocating authority that fits really nicely into what we teach at XO about decentralization, distributed authority, things like that. Maybe a year or so ago, in a conversation that Alan and I had, he began to share this idea of something he calls the long shadow of leadership. And I said, Alan, that would make a great keynote. And so Alan is going to give us a shorter version of this today. And in the show notes for this, you'll see where you can reach out to Alan. Highly recommend that you bring Alan into your organization to give this talk to your leaders. And you'll see in watching this why. So with no further applause and accolades, welcome Alan.
Thank you very much, Justin, for that very kind and warm introduction. And thank you all for joining me. I wanted to start by telling you a story about Tim, a former client of mine who was the founder and CEO of a medical implants manufacturing company. When you hear his story, you may also feel like it's your story as well. In our very first conversation, Tim told me that he felt like his VP of operations was stealing from him, not literally, but because he was not delivering on what Tim wanted or needed from him. Then he said to me, I'm not sure if he's a keeper. He went on to tell me how smart the guy was and that he went to West Point. I asked a simple question. How long has he been in the role? 9 years, Tim responded. I responded, if you don't know if he's a keeper after 9 years, then you're the problem, not him. And oh, by the way, if you feel he's stealing money, I bet you he feels the exact same way. And that if you and he really doesn't have the courage to leave. I then told Tim, if you fire him, he's going to thank you. Tim thought I was crazy. I'm going to leave you in a little suspense with this story, but we will come back to talk about it. So stick around. A leader's strength, our resolve and commitment naturally casts a shadow on those we lead, which unintendedly shrinks others. Each of us brings energy and light, including those we lead. If you're not aware of or attend to your own leadership shadow, you will dim the light and energy of others. The impact, here we go. There we go. The impact of dimming the energy and light of others is profound, and it harms our businesses. A leader's shadow encourages deference, which lowers risk tolerance, suppresses ideas, and reduces velocity. When that happens, people take fewer risks, they share fewer ideas, they become resigned, and velocity in the organization slows down. The exact opposite of what we would want to be creating. Ultimately, those we lead become fearful that a mistake may cause them harm to their career or even worse, possibly their livelihood. The results you're getting or not getting in your business are directly tied to the shadow you cast as a leader. Too often in business, we focus on results, solving problems, putting systems and processes in place. However, it's the people who solve problems using systems and structure to support them. Leaders frequently say, our people are our most important asset, yet their actions and their shadow communicate something very different. Our job as leaders is to enable those we lead to bring their full energy, their full light to what's needed, not dim it. Think this doesn't apply to you? Think again. Every leader has a shadow, regardless of whether or not you have a dominant personality. The question becomes, are you going to be responsible for your shadow? I love this quote, which is an excerpt from Larry Bossidy's book, Execution. If you haven't read it, you should. It's an excellent book. If this is true, and I believe it is, then our jobs as leaders is to create an environment for others to be the best version of themselves every single day. This is my definition of a self-aware leader. It's not complicated. However, it's easier said than done. My many years of observing leaders has had me reveal a few key traits about a self-aware leader that I'd like to share with you. First, they're principled. They're empathetic. They're pragmatic, insightful, and sincere. I'd like you to take a moment, and I don't want you to overthink it, to rate yourself on each of these 5 traits on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 being, I most consistently demonstrate this trait, and 1 being, I least consistently demonstrate this trait. So go ahead, take a moment, and rate yourself. If I was doing a workshop, I would have people share how they rated themselves, and we'd have a conversation about it. But I'm not going to be doing that with you today. I would like to share a few stories with you of self-aware leaders. You're probably familiar with Brian Chesky, the founder and CEO of Airbnb. He's a terrific example of a self-aware leader. When COVID hit, like many companies, Airbnb was hit hard. To survive, they had to lay off a lot of workers. Brian's approach, in my opinion, was extraordinarily humane and generous. He told his leadership team that they would use their values to inform their decisions about what to do. He knew that they were going to be letting go a lot of really good people who did nothing to deserve being let go. They provided very generous severance packages and offered full medical coverage for a full 12 months after they let those employees go. He called on his CEO network to explore if any of them would be able to hire any of the 900 people he was going to be letting go. He wanted the people he let go to feel valued, appreciated, under very difficult circumstances. Because when things changed, and if there was an opportunity for him to hire people back, he wanted them to feel like they could come back to work for Airbnb. The next leader I want to share with you has to do with the baseball team. The 2022 Phillies season started with optimism for a long playoff run. After a disappointing start to the season, 22-29 record, the Phillies fired their manager, Joe Girardi, and promoted their bench coach, Rob Thompson. Rob had already told management that year that he was going to retire after the season. Under Thompson's leadership, the Phillies thrived and turned around their season, recording a 65-46 win-loss record the rest of the way. They snuck into the playoffs as the sixth and final seeded team. Not only did they sneak into the playoffs, but they went on to an improbable run into the World Series. Sadly, they lost. The difference? Joe Girardi was managing with a strong commitment to analytics, which is very common in baseball today. But he seemingly didn't understand his players' desire to want to know when they would be used and how they would be used. He moved players around in the batting order, changed under what circumstances the relief pitchers would be pitching. Thompson managed differently. Yes, he used analytics, but he recognized that his players wanted to know how they were going to be used. What it looks like is a position player knowing what position and where in the batting order they were going to be batting, really on a consistent basis. And if you're a relief pitcher, were you going to be pitching as a closer, a setup man, or a long reliever? Thompson also displayed a lot of trust in his players. He didn't jerk them around the batting order just because of statistics or the fact that they may have been on a streak of poor performance at the plate. He exhibited belief in his players. This picture is emblematic of that belief. This is of Rhys Hoskins, the longest tenured position player at the time, who had been struggling at the plate. Thompson stuck with him and showed confidence in him. This was his reaction after hitting a home run in a playoff game that year, spiking the bat as if to say, "I told you so." This inspired his teammates, and they went on to win that series. And as I mentioned, they ended up in the World Series. In 2023, they did it again, getting yet just one game away from going back to the World Series. The last two seasons, they started slowly, and this year, in 2024, they committed to starting quickly, which they did. And today, as I share this with you, they have the best record in Major League Baseball. Thompson had never been a Major League manager before, but clearly this self-aware leader understands how to lead. His retirement has been put on hold. You may not know Indira Nooyi, but you certainly know the company she's led. Indira is a wonderful example of a self-aware leader who has worked for PepsiCo for 24 years and was the CEO for 12. Employees described her leadership style as being charismatic, characterized by pragmatism, empathy, vision, and a deep sense of responsibility. She exemplified how leadership was not just about driving results and business success, but also about fostering a culture of care, compassion, and inclusivity. Her strategic redirection of PepsiCo was called Performance with a Purpose, focused on creating long-term growth while leaving a positive impact on society and the environment. She redirected PepsiCo's products into three categories: fun for you, such as potato chips and regular soda; better for you, diet or low-fat versions of snacks and sodas; and good for you, items such as oatmeal, water, Tropicana, and Naked Juice. She moved corporate spending away from junk foods and into healthier alternatives, with an aim of improving the healthiness of even the fun for you offerings. Under Indira's leadership, PepsiCo experienced significant growth and profitability. Net profit margins increased over 230%. Revenue increased over 80%, and the stock price doubled. I'd say that's a great demonstration of the impact a self-aware leader can make. Now let's look at the converse: an ego-blind leader unaware of their shadow. This is a real-life example, it's not fictional, of a leader I met and later learned about from some of their staff, which was about 120 people. This person was dictatorial, dishonest, misrepresenting the team's results, disinterested, communicating to their staff that they were too busy to meet with them. They wouldn't even meet one-on-one with their own direct reports. They were disrespectful as everything was urgent, regardless of the time of day, night, or on weekends. They arrived late to meetings, left early, and never showed up with some altogether. They frequently rescheduled their own meetings at the very last minute. And maybe the worst of all traits is they sought the glory for all the success of the team. Talk about someone who creates deference, risk aversion, and suppresses velocity and good ideas. Their employees were in survival mode. They were not thriving. Then it seemed to get worse. They were hiring a new CEO, and just before that CEO was about to start, they fired this leader and replaced them with someone in the organization. I learned later that a VP who was now reporting to the new senior VP had been told previously when someone challenged them, they were asked to fire them. This is what ego blind and insecure leaders do. And this is what a legacy of insecure leaders looks like. Listen, we all have a shadow, we all have an ego, and we're not going to get rid of either our ego or our shadow. It's important to know that there's nothing wrong or bad about having a shadow or an ego. All there is an opportunity to be responsible for them. Owning your shadows starts with a different kind of 360, one that shines a light on your shadows. It requires curiosity, courage, responsibility, and commitment. First and foremost, you must create a safe space for people to share with you honestly. And it starts with a simple question. Do you feel safe to give me honest feedback about my leadership style? If they say no, that's a big red flag about your shadow, and you definitely want to follow up and know why. If they say yes, the question's rather simple. What is one frequent behavior of mine which impacts you the most? I'm only looking for one because it's based on the 80-20 principle. The few gives the many. So if I can work on the one thing that makes the most impact, I'm going to get the biggest bang for my buck. And the perfect follow-up question is tell me more. Just by saying that, people reveal more that gives you greater clarity and understanding. Then ask, if I change this behavior, how will it make me a better leader? If you don't or I don't benefit from making change, I can rest assured we're not going to do it. We have to get to what's in it for me if I do this. And then lastly, we want to ask, do you think others would say the same thing about the last two questions? When you do this type of 360 and ask these questions, of course, you want to ask your boss, your peers, and your direct reports. You also want to get the opinions of people you don't necessarily get along with so well, or don't have great working relationships with. Don't just ask the people you're friends with or have very good working relationship with. Once you have honest feedback about your shadows, it's time to be self-reflective and ask yourself a few questions. What is the source of my behavior? You won't get the answer to this question quickly. It requires some contemplation. I like to take a walk and ask myself questions and see what emerges. The next question is this behavior consistent with my values? I love this question because it takes us back to our values. Just as Brian Chesky did when he was guided by or used his values to guide the decision making they had to make during COVID. And lastly, am I willing to change this behavior? You may not be. Don't kid yourself. Oh, and as I mentioned before, how will I benefit from the changing of the behavior? If there's no benefit, we're likely not going to do it. Now I'd like to share with you my shadow, or some of my shadows, should I say. Early in my career as a leader, I was told I was intimidating. My size, I'm 6'4", my physical presence, especially when I was in a suit and tie with my booming voice, passion, and confidence, intimidated others. All this coupled with my direct communication style, my assertive behavior, was clearly part of my leadership shadow, which reduced the energy and the light of those around me. I was certainly not committed to this, but it was the result of who I was being. I wasn't aware of my shadow. A few years into my first managerial job, my boss Keith called me into his office. Keith and I had a great working relationship. He said to me, "Someone complained about you, saying that you're too hard on them." I responded, "What did you do?" He said, "I asked them, who else in the division would you want to work for?" They responded, "No one." Then Keith looked at me and asked, "How do you do that? How do you piss people off so they complain about you, but they don't want to work for anyone else?" I said, "That's a great question, Keith. Did you ask them?" "Of course I did," Keith said. "So what did they say?" Their response was, "I will learn more from Alan than I'd ever learn from anyone else." I then went on to explain to Keith that I had very high standards for myself and for everyone I lead. I treated everyone the same. I don't treat them any differently than anyone else. This too was part of my shadow. I came to realize that my high expectations were tough on people. I know this because I've come to realize they're tough on me as well. Over the years, I've learned to be responsible for who I am and how I show up for others. Business casual helped. I stopped wearing suits and started rocking stylish blazers. It allowed me to be more authentic, express my personality, and it certainly made me more approachable. I worked on being softer in my communication. I'm still direct, but I hope a little softer. I'm not perfect, but I'm aware of and constantly looking out for and paying attention to the shadow I may be casting as a leader. More recently, I've leaned into and embraced my spiritual side. Doing so has helped me improve how I show up for others. Today, I'm guided by spirit. I lead, coach, consult, and problem solve through my spirit. Being responsible for my shadow is a constant work in progress. Now back to our story about Tim, our CEO. As I mentioned, Tim felt his VP of operations was stealing from him because he wasn't delivering on his role. And I told him if he fired the VP would thank him. Of course, Tim thought I was crazy. 3 weeks later, Tim called me, and the first thing he said to me was, "I did it." "What did you do?" I said. "I fired him." "What happened?" I asked. "Almost word for word what you said is what happened," Tim shared. This was, through this process, Tim realized that his leadership shadow was hindering his leaders' growth and development. The firing gave Tim the opportunity to promote an existing employee to take the lead in operations. He was richly rewarded as his new leader took the reins and exceeded Tim's expectations. Excuse me. In our work together, Tim started holding his ops leader and the rest of his leadership team accountable in a way that he never had before. Not only did his operations lead step up, but so too did the rest of his leadership team. Previously, Tim was unaware of the impact his shadow was casting on his leaders. 8 months into our work together, Tim informed me that he was getting offers to buy his company. He explained that 2 years earlier, he had lookers, but they said that his leadership team wasn't strong enough. We then went to work to help him sell his company. He got 2 offers, and I encouraged him to speak with the CEO of his biggest customer, which was a publicly traded company, to explore the possibility of a third offer. That didn't pan out, but Tim did successfully sell his company. And he told me he got everything he wanted from the sale because of me. The truth is, Tim was successful selling his company, not because of me, but because he took responsibility for his shadow. He took responsibility for his leadership. The result was that the suitors for the business saw a capable, empowered leadership team that was worth buying. This is what's possible when we get to work on our shadows. Are you curious about your shadow, your leadership shadow, and its impact? If so, you can scan the QR code on this screen, or you can jump onto my website. The address is there for you, and we can get on an introductory call, and we'll investigate your situation. I thank you for joining me and look forward to speaking with you in the future. Justin, I believe we're going to take some questions. Is that right? I think you're muted, Justin.
Dang it. It's only been 7 years of using Zoom. Yeah,
All right,
Ron and I are
stop
gonna,
sharing my screen. Is that
well,
good?
leave that
Oh,
QR code up
okay.
there for just a minute longer, for people that are watching this recording
Thank
later.
you.
I'll
Thank
tell
you.
you, let's take it down in like 2 minutes. But yeah, this is in the Meet the Experts structure. What we're doing is that Ron and I and Jeremy, who couldn't join us today, we want to interview our various experts, and then take questions from the guests that are here as well. So Ron, I'll kick it over to you. What
Yeah,
you want to open with the first question?
I will. Alan, thanks for the presentation. Yeah, the notion of a leader's shadow just resonates so well with me.
You're
But
welcome.
there's
Thank you.
something that's striking me here is, yeah, do you believe that there are leaders that are simply unaware of their shadow versus those that are incapable of seeing their shadow?
Well, I'm a behavioral analyst, and in the books that they use to train people, they talk about people's who are mentally stable. So when you ask that question, who are capable, I'd say that somebody who's healthy mentally is capable, right? So if someone's not, then yes, they might be uncapable. So I don't think
Yeah,
it's a capability issue. I think it actually points to a blindness issue. Some of the work I do,
yeah.
we talk about um, our ability to be out here in the world. The
Hmm.
world doesn't happen in our head. For many of us, it does, of course.
Right. Yes.
We all go in our head. I'm not saying that that's different for anybody, but really self-aware leaders are able to more frequently get out of their own head and get out here in the world where you and I and everyone else interacts. And if we're
Hmm.
out here in the world, I'm sensitive and aware to what I say and how it impacts you. And if I say something that you may not say upset you, but I could see in your face it might have upset you. If I'm out here with you, I can be responsible for it right away. If I'm in my head focused on me, I would never do that.
Hmm.
Does
Yeah.
that answer your question?
It does to an extent, the blindness.
Yeah.
Because what I'm struck with is, often, you know, what you're describing in terms of uh, empathy and being uh, focused on enabling a team is, a fundamental need for leadership. However, you know, I see so many leaders, or uh, quote leaders unquote, who you know as the case you described, they're focused on the results and taking credit, and all the things that are feeding the ego of the leader, but ignoring the team that's behind the leader. And
Yeah.
trying to distinguish, or see if there is a distinction between those that are so ego blind that you know getting them to become aware, willing to become aware of their shadow and change behavior, versus those that are, you know, inherently empathetic and simply not yet equipped to provide the self-aware leadership that you're describing.
Yeah. You made me think of a story when you were just sharing all that. So I had a
Mhm.
client years ago, was the senior vice president, North American sales of Oracle. And before we started on the project, I was going to be developing a custom leadership training program for 45 of his direct reports. We had a conversation and he said to me, I was at a dinner and I was sitting at a table with Paul O'Neill, who was the former Treasury Secretary of the United States under
Mhm.
Bush, and also the former CEO of Alcoa, if you know who he was. And they were having a conversation about leadership. And Paul asked my client, Keith, he said, well, where do they teach leadership? And Keith said, at college. And Paul said, there's only 4 colleges that teach leadership, and they're called military academies.
Yeah.
And so the truth is, we don't really have in this country a great source of training for leaders other than the leadership, the military academies. And if you work in a large organization, they invest in leadership development. But
Mhm.
if you don't, you're kind of left on your own.
Yeah.
And that's where the
True.
blindness comes in, right? Because we're
Mhm.
not trained to actually to what it looks like to be a good leader.
Yes,
Yeah.
I agree with that, entirely. Um, but I also think that it leads to placing individuals in leadership roles that, you know, don't have the training, don't have the background, but also don't have the innate ability. And that is a failure of the leader that put that leader in place.
Absolutely. Listen, it's very simple. We have the way leaders get created in this country is you're a top individual performer. And if
Mhm.
you excel, it doesn't matter whether you're in sales, engineering, procurement, manufacturing, whatever it is, and you're top individual performer, and then someone sees you and they say, oh, Ron's great. Let's promote him to manager because
Yeah.
he'll take his greatness and show everybody else in the team how to be great at
Mhm.
their jobs. Only
Yeah.
being great at your job has nothing to do with being a great manager.
It's a completely different skill set. Yes.
Right. And so that's how the process starts. And if that person or persons that become managers for the first time aren't developed to be managers, then they just perpetuate what they already know.
Yeah.
And that's why they become like a super individual performer, not really a manager.
Hmm. Indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to that too, that I believe that only 2 former quarterbacks have won the Super Bowl as head coaches. And they were both what they call a cup of coffee type quarterback, like Sean Payton, who now is the coach of the Broncos. He played briefly as in the professionals. I think the other one was Tom Flores, way back in the
You're going
80s with
way
the
back.
Raiders.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's the Raiders. You got to go way back. Unfortunately, as a Raider fan, I say that. So it's funny, you and I have talked about this topic of long shadow of leadership for a long time, and I was like, man, I wonder if I'm going to have any questions, but I do. So
That's a
we probably
silly
won't get.
question to ask, Justin. I know
I
you
Yeah.
do.
know, I know,
All right.
I know. So I'm,
Go
I'm
for it,
picking and
Justin.
choosing here because of the time that we have. But I think I want to start with this one is, and it's kind of, let me give it some context. Is it seems like this idea of a self-aware leader is timeless. I think Ken Blanchard was one of the first to kind of look at like in a non-religious way, look at Jesus as like a leadership model. Or
Okay.
and there are other examples of this, where you take these ancient figures and apply them to modern thinking. I have a essay I wrote called "The Philosopher CEO" that says, well, how would Marcus Aurelius perform as a CEO today? Um, what it does seem like, however, is for a period of time, that if you had power and there was no distribution of information like we see today with the hyperconnectivity, well, I'll put it in a less delicate way. For years, if you were an asshole, the only people that knew it were the people around you. And if you had power, the more power you had, the more you could kind of contain that. So you hear about somebody later that they were a horrible person. But pretty much every leader now is in a fishbowl.
Yep.
They're in a fishbowl and they're being observed, and there's everything from Glassdoor to social media to, water cooler talk. So I'm sure that Ron and you and others, we could walk into any business and ask a few people who are the assholes here, and they'd be able to tell us.
Yep.
So my question to that is, that's a level of ego blindness that results in sort of harmful or abusive behavior in order for someone to get the title of asshole. How in modern business do they get that far? In considering that, like, this is not new. That this fishbowl has been in effect for about 15 years now, maybe a little longer. How do they get away with it? How do they continue with that being that way and not be exposed or kicked out?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll give you some answers, but I certainly don't have the answer because I struggle with that one as well. And in my example that I used of the unaware, egocentric leader that didn't work, they were operating inside a $5+ billion organization. They had, like I said, about 120 employees, and they were really, that group was kind of like a cocoon of the rest of the business. They were not part of the mainstream of the rest of the business. So in that case, they kind of operated with a certain amount of impunity, because you needed to have the courage, to stand up to the person, right, for anything to change. And I later learned that the CEO who left and had brought them in originally was happy with the results they were doing. So what typically happens is, if we're satisfied with the results, we kind of ignore the behaviors. And I've talked with CEOs, and I literally dealing with some poor performers, some poor behaviors. And I asked, do you have a no asshole policy? And some of them look at me like, what's that? Like, they don't even know, right?
Yeah.
So how does it perpetuate itself is we prioritize results over culture, right?
Exactly.
And again, that I would suggest is a certain amount of ignorance by the leader that allows it to happen, because the other example I gave of Indira was the opposite. She prioritized the culture, and I've never met her. I haven't heard her speak, but I'm pretty certain she wouldn't allow an asshole to hang around her organization very long if she knew about it.
So I would suggest there's, part of it is inertia. It's more difficult to make the change than it is to continue on and suffer what's going on. The second thing is, with Indira, I think, she was taking a much longer view than those that are results focused. Is, for whatever reason, getting performance today, this month, this year, outweighs the damage that's being caused to the culture in the organization.
I really appreciate you saying that, Ron, because one of the things that stood out for me when Google went public was, and I affectionately refer to the founders as the Google boys. I know they're not boys anymore, they're men, but when they said, we're not going to give quarterly guidance. If you want to invest in our company, you're investing in the long-term vision of what we're committed to. And what you're pointing to is that Wall Street's obsession with quarterly, you could say their obsession with quarterly results has actually trained the executives to behave this way.
Yeah.
I believe that's exacerbated the issue.
Yeah. We could do a whole episode on just the long shadow of Milton Friedman and the up and to the right culture that he created. And the antithesis of this are like Peter Drucker, who warned us about all this stuff years and years ago. You know, when he said culture eats strategy for breakfast. Go ahead and stop screen sharing, Ron. I'm going to ask,
Sure.
Alan, I'm going to ask you one more question.
Go ahead.
Just a quick answer on this one. Then I want to kick it over to the other guests that have joined us. So feel free to come on camera if you're not already, or if you want to, if you have a question you want to ask. And this is just a quick response type question, Alan, is what ego traits cast the longest shadow? I mean, it's true that the shadow comes from the ego, but there's really long shadows, and then there's, you know, little short shadows. What are some what are your kind of immediate reaction to that? What are the ego traits that cast the longest shadow?
You know, I just go back to my example. It's somebody who's self-important, right? They prioritize themselves over others. You know, great leaders talk all about the honor it is to lead another person, which it is, right? And it takes, you know, it requires some great commitment and responsibility. But there's many leaders that simply just don't look at it that way, and that they look at leadership as how do they get ahead? It's about them. It's not about the people they're leading. So
Yeah,
I don't know for sure, but that's my initial reaction to what you say.
yeah,
And
yeah.
before we go to the next question, I just wanted to add one other thing. Yes, we have our own shadows as leaders, but let's not forget that our title and position also casts a shadow independent of our person,
Right.
right?
Great
And I had
point.
a wonderful example of that this week. On Wednesday night, I went to an award ceremony and fundraiser, whatever, for and they awarded a two-star general an award, and she got up and spoke. And even though they had already acknowledged the servicemen and women in the audience, which was about half the audience, during her talk, she said, this is almost a quote, "I'm no longer a general, but I'd like to ask all the service people to please stand up again and be acknowledged." So first of all, she was being responsible for her title, right? Not the fact that she was a leader, but the title of two-star general. And because she knew that just because she was a two-star general, if she gives, it wasn't an order, but if she gives an order, they're going to actually respond, right? And afterwards, I went up to her and I thanked her for her service. And I said, "I apologize for my ignorance because I never served in the military. But aren't you a two-star general for the rest of your life?" And she smiled and she said, "Yes, but I didn't want them to take it as an order." So she was being responsible for the title shadow, not just her own.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So there's a question in the chat that we'll throw out here, Alan, is it says the 360 is a place to start, but from there, how does a leader learn about their shadow, especially if it's a blind spot? So I think that there's a conundrum there. Like you could get all the answers to those questions, but how do they actually learn about it, and then what do they do to start to shift it to becoming a self-aware leader?
Yeah, well, the learning about it really does happen in the 360, you know, and I would say if you're really committed to it, you're getting a coach to not only help you with the 360, but with the execution of what I'm going to do about it after the fact, right? It reminds me of a story of a top executive of, I think it was a private equity firm, and a consultant was brought into by the board member and said, "We're about ready to promote this person to be the CEO, but there's one issue that's really a problem. And before we promote them, we want them to deal with the issue." And back to what I said, notice what they said, one issue, right? And so they were willing to get them a coach, and they spent, I think it was 6 to 9 months working with this leader to help them deal with those issues before they promoted him to CEO.
Wow. Any other questions from the our participants? Adam, I see you're on camera. Do you have any questions for Alan?
No, but this is fascinating. I would just, I have a very small agency, but I will state I was really enjoying about the ego driven leadership. And I personally was that way and then flipped it. And now I'm almost the opposite. And our productivity has gone up significantly. It's just the whole organization is better.
Well, first of all, good for
Mm.
you, Adam, and congratulations. And what you're pointing to is both how simple and how difficult it is, right? The difficult part, it's a little bit like the alcoholic, right? You got to admit that you're an alcoholic first,
Mhm.
right? And
Mhm.
and it's what I said, Adam. It's that the results we're getting or not getting are directly tied to our shadow, and you realize
Yeah.
that you did something
Yeah.
about it, and you're reaping the rewards of your actions. So good for you, and
Exactly.
thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, it's been like the top down ego driven leadership. It just doesn't work.
No, well,
Yeah, it doesn't
it
work.
works.
Yeah.
It just doesn't produce the results we're committed
Yeah, well, it doesn't work as
Yeah.
well as
Yeah, or
Right.
for very long, right?
for,
Yeah.
for very long.
Exactly.
And it's
Right.
it's interesting, Adam, what you said too. Just even thank you for your vulnerability with that too. And I think, and I'm curious about this reaction, maybe just for the room, but you, Ellen, you mentioned like being an alcoholic, and I think that there's an addiction. I think especially people that you know, and I'll call it what it is, like white dudes, you know, that if coming from a place of privilege, especially if you're educated and you come from middle class or wealth or something. I've noticed this is that if you're from a traditionally marginalized group, you have a very different relationship with power. And it doesn't mean you don't have blind spots and shadows and nobody's perfect. But I'm curious about from like a almost like a societal structure, is that just me having sort of a woke
just let me
perspective,
interrupt you
or is
with
that
a quick
real?
story. So
Yeah.
I coached youth basketball for like 12 years.
Okay.
And and I'm also a big dude. So I would on a very small scale, people, the youth, the kids I coached, ability to rebound was directly proportional to their socioeconomic status.
Really?
Yes.
Do tell.
Yeah.
So
I know exactly where you're going, Adam. Please tell us.
the rich white kids didn't, when I don't know, you guys play basketball or whatever sport. So,
Yeah.
you know, when you're rebounding, it's pretty intense down there, right? You're throwing your body around. It's ultimately, you know, it's who wants it more, right? And the kids that don't have money and privilege have more grit. So they're not afraid to get hit, and they want the rebound.
There you
But
go.
their
Great
defense is
microcosm.
more
Yeah.
intense. They're just
Interesting.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
all things being
Yeah.
equal, they want it more.
Right.
So true.
Great story.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Justin,
Ron, do you have any more? Ron, you always have good questions. You know,
Yeah. No.
Oh, go ahead, Alan. Before we go to.
I was going to
yeah.
share something. I don't know what someone said, but it popped into my head. I think part of the problem, and maybe it's what Adam shared his own personal story, and yes, thank you for your vulnerability, is I think too often we think that a leader's job is to have all the answers. And this notion forces them to behave a certain way.
Mhm.
When in reality, a leader's job is to filter through information and get to a best possible answer to whatever the situation may be. And I was reminded, I got the opportunity to experience senior VP at Hershey Corporation actually run meetings. I was sitting observing him run meetings. And really great leaders are the last ones to talk, not the first. So he would sit there and really his talking during the meeting was nothing more than asking people for their opinion or their point of view or challenging their point of view or how did you come to that determination? Not to try and belittle them in any way, but to try and understand where they were looking from and where they were thinking from. And with all that information, he could then make decisions and or empower people to do what they already thought was the appropriate thing to do, was to green light them. So it wasn't about him having the answers. It was him getting to what's the best possible solution under the circumstances.
Yeah.
And I think
Wow.
that's a big contributor, this idea of I have to have all the answers of why leaders behave the way they do.
Yeah. Also,
So-
real quick trivia, because I'm a nerd, and I'll throw it to Ron. Adam, just I'm live fact checking something before I give this opinion. Is
You are a
that
nerd.
I am a nerd. The last white American player to lead the league in rebounds was Kevin Love in 2010. Prior to that, it was Jerry West in the 60s.
Holy
So
Wow.
that's such a fascinating thing. There's a whole blog post there, Adam, for you to write.
Yeah,
If you need some
right.
help with that, get it out there.
Oh,
Let
yeah,
me
we're
know.
good at it. And I didn't say white, I said economic, right?
Right.
Well, you said the rich, the kid, the rich white kids.
That's where I was from, but that's true.
Yeah,
Right.
I know.
Yes.
I'll say.
But
I'll say
the different areas they happened to be more
Yes.
minorities, and they were better.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Right.
Ron, last question
So-
for Alan, then we'll shut her down.
Well, more of a comment here is,
Okay.
the management training I received, some of the better that's available, spoke about situational leadership styles. And, Alan, what you're describing is the collaborative style that is important, or nurturing styles. There is also the authoritative, or having the answers kind of style. And the one that always stuck with me is there is a need from time to time for, I forget the term for it, but it is the building is on fire, get out.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. But, what happens is, particularly for those that are less self-aware, they get stuck in one of the styles, and particularly that last style, because, that's how they get results. And they're completely ignoring the input and capabilities of the team that's around them. And that's where becoming aware of, the shadow and, addressing the effects of it is what's important. So,
I'm going to jump in with one last thing because you triggered it for me. And that is, you said management training. And what I heard was, oh, wait, there is a distinct difference between management
and leadership. Yes.
And often we confuse them. So I really appreciate that you said it, Ron.
You're right.
My definition of management is that we manage things, sales processes, projects, the books, whatever.
Right.
And we lead people. And I think that frequently we collapse the two.
We do. And, the tradition I came from collapsed it. But that distinction is important. And I like the way you describe it is, leadership of people, management of things. That's a great distinction.
And power, unhealthy power, allows you to keep that backwards for a long time. So, well, thank you so much, Alan, for your presentation.
Yes, thank you.
This recording will be out on our channels at the Fractional XO. If you are a CEO or a founder and you are looking for a way to transform your organization and increase its velocity and its wisdom, we invite you to have a conversation with us. Our link to talk to us is in the show notes, and we will give you access to amazing people like Alan. And of course, reach out to Alan as well if you would like to learn more about his services, and especially, as I said, to bring him into your organization, give this talk. And stay tuned for the next episode of Meet the Experts, which will be coming up in October. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.